the updated ASHE-Census dataset. My name is John Forth. I work at Bayes Business School, and I'm part of this Wage and Employment Dynamics project. Let me start by just telling you a little bit about the project. So this project is focused on the annual survey for hours and earnings, or ASHE. It's the UK's official source of data on earnings and hours, based on a 1% sample of employee jobs. So it's an annual survey. Obviously, what the ONS do, they take an annual sample from the PAYE register. They mail out to the employers of those jobs, and they ask them for data on earnings and hours. So what we're trying to do in this project is firstly to catalogue and clean the data. So any of you who've used microdata coming out of the ONS, it's not always in what we would call a completely research-ready format. Often the documentation is a little bit sparse, and the data sometimes need a little bit of extra cleaning, labelling, quality assurance. And that's partly because the ONS have been using it themselves. They're familiar with it. They use it for specific purposes, and they don't tend to have the resource to invest in making it research ready for people who've not used it before. So one of our goals is really to catalogue and clean the data, provide documentation. We've been compiling a quick start guide for new ASHE users. So if you've never used ASHE before, there's a short sort of 5-10 page quick start guide to show you how to get going. So that's one objective of the project. We've also been improving and testing the links between jobs and people, because if you have a specific national insurance number that ends in a specific 2 digits, you will always be in the ASHE sample whenever you're in a PAYE job. So you have the potential to be in the achieved sample every year, and so you can link people across time longitudinally. So we've been proving those links with the ONS, and also trying to link jobs, because some people have multiple jobs in the data set. So if you want to follow jobs, it's a little bit more tricky. And then the other part of our work, which in some ways is the main part, is linking ASHE to other data resources. So for example, linking data to ONS business data on the employing unit. So we've been doing some work on non-response in ASHE, which involves us linking the data to the business structured database. What we've done in that work is shown that certain types of jobs are underrepresented in ASHE. We've derived some new weights for the data set. The thing I'm going to talk about today is some work linking ASHE to the 2011 census, and I'll explain the reason for that in a bit more detail in a moment. But essentially, ASHE as a data set doesn't tell you much about the employee's personal characteristics. The reason for that is that ASHE is completed by the employer, so there's only a certain amount that you can expect them to know. So we've been linking ASHE to the 2011 census with ONS in order to improve the range of personal characteristics on the dataset. One thing we've just started is linking ASHE to HMRC PAYE data on employment and earnings. So ASHE is one snapshot at one particular time in the year, in April, but HMRC have data which follows those individuals all through the year. So you can see when they're in and out of work and what their earnings are at different points in the year. So that helps us to fill in the gap between the 2 consecutive April observations. So that's the PAYE data, which we're just getting to grips with now. And ONS have also been helping us to link ASHE to self-assessment data. So if you do a self-assessment tax return, you'll know that you're reporting not only on your employee income, which would be in ASHE, but also on your self-employed income or other income. So by linking to self-assessment returns, we can get a broader picture of somebody's income beyond their employee earnings. And then a fourth item on the list here is linking to migrant worker scan data. Now, not something we've started yet, but it's in our programme of work. We're funded to link ASHE to the migrant worker scan data, which is administrative data on people entering the UK, and that will enable us to identify migrants in the ASHE dataset and then look at their wage progression and so on. So it's a broad programme of work. If you want to understand a bit more about what we're doing, you can go and check out our website, wagedynamics.com. We are in the process of a website refresh, which Naomi's leading, but all of the key information is there. If you can't find anything that you're looking for, just drop us a line. I'll leave my contact details at the end of the slide deck. Okay, so that's the project. What are we going to do today? Well, I'm going to talk to you briefly about the motivation for the ASHE-Census linkage. I've already previewed that a little bit. I'll talk about the linkage process. So how have we gone about linking these two data sets and what are the outcomes in drop 2? So there are some people on the call who've already used the first drop. I'll explain how the second drop of the data set is different. I'll talk a little bit about how we address linkage bias. When you link two data sets, it's very rare that you get perfect correspondence. So there'll be some types of records that don't get linked. They have the possibility to introduce bias into the linked sample. I'll talk about how we've been addressing that issue. And I'll also give a quick insight into some illustrative analysis using the data, just so you have a little idea of what can be done with this ASHE-Census dataset. So do ask questions of clarification as we go along. If I say anything that you're not quite clear on, do please butt in. You can either just unmute yourself and ask your question, or you can raise your virtual hand here on Teams, or you can put a question in the chat. And Naomi is going to monitor the chat and monitor for hands. I will try and leave some time for general questions at the end. But do butt in if you've got a question as we go. So the disclaimer, as always, this work is produced using statistical data from ONS, the ASHE dataset that is available in the Secure Research Service. ONS don't necessarily endorse what the interpretation or the analysis of the data, and the research datasets that we use might not exactly reproduce the national statistics algorithms. So motivation for linking ASHE and Census. Well, ASHE, as I said, is a survey that is completed by an employer. They are sent a return asking them details of the earnings and hours of a particular person in a particular job. And when they return that ASHE questionnaire, they report on the employee's age, their gender, their residential location. But otherwise, the information in the ASHE return is all about the job, the earnings, the hours, the occupation, or you have data on the data set about the employer, so its size, industry, legal status. So as you can see, very limited information about the employee themselves. Now, of course, in the census, you have very full information about an individual. Census 2011 collected data on a person's country of birth, on their proficiency with the English language, their ethnicity, religion, marital or civil partnership status, health, disability, importantly, their educational and vocational qualifications, but also their household circumstances. So you can see if you could link these two data sets together, it would create potentially a powerful combination, because you'd have a lot more information about the individual employee themselves. In particular, if you have data on qualifications from Census that you could bring into the ASHE dataset, you'd be able to look for the first time at return to human capital using ASHE. You can't do that at the moment because ASHE doesn't have any data itself on how qualified the individual is. Because you've got these various personal characteristics, you can look at wage gaps by not only gender, but also ethnicity and disability. And when I show you some illustrative analysis later, it will be focused on ethnic wage gaps. Of course, because you've got a country of birth indicator in the census, you have the potential to use the ASHE-Census dataset to look at wage progression among migrants. And of course, you could look at things like how important is it whether the partner's in work? How does that shape the individual's earnings? Okay, so I hope you get the sense of what we're trying to do here through this linkage, essentially adding many new personal characteristics onto ASHE which aren't there at the moment. So what about the potential to link these data sets? Well, as I say, ASHE is a 1% sample of PAYE jobs in Britain. What ONS do is they draw the sample from the PAYE register in January of each year, and they top it up in April. And then when the employer gets the questionnaire for ASHE, they're asked to report on that employee's earnings and hours for a particular reference date, usually in mid-April. So in 2011, it was the 13th of April. If we then look at the census, the 2011 census, we're dealing here with the census of England and Wales. So the census for Scotland is made available by ONS under different conditions. We haven't had access to the census for Scotland. We've only had access to the census for England and Wales. Of course, because it's a census, all employees in England and Wales should be observed in that data set. So if you're in ASHE in 2011, then in theory, you should be in the census. We should be able to find you there somewhere in the census for England and Wales if you were located in England and Wales at that time. Census day was 27th of March 2011. So you can see the two reference dates for the two surveys are reasonably close in time, only a couple of weeks apart. So that's helpful because it means if you were in employment when on census day in 27th of March, odds are you were probably still in employment on the 13th of April 2011, probably still in the same job. And ONS have access to various disclosive information about the people who complete ASHE and the people who completed the census. So although these data aren't made publicly available, ONS know the first name, the middle name, and the surname of the individuals in ASHE and the individuals in the census. They know their date of birth, gender, and home postcode. So these personal details, these fields, and the job details, occupation, industry, and work postcode, they're present on both data sets. So they enable us to try and create a link between the two data sets by virtue of matches on these common fields. Okay, so the linkage potential on the face of it looks good. So what ONS do, we in the WED project, the academics in the WED project don't do the matching because we're not allowed to have access to this personal information. ONS have done the linking for us, and then we have assisted them with some queries and some suggestions, and also we've taken the lead on all of the documentation of the linked data set. So what they've done is they take all individuals who are resident in England and Wales, in other words, their home address is in England and Wales. They've taken all of those individuals who appear in either ASHE 2010, 2011, or 2012, and they've sought to match those people with the individuals who appear in the 2011 census. So notice they haven't just focused on ASHE 2011, they've also looked for people who might be in ASHE 2010, but not in 2011. So maybe if somebody is moving in and out of work, because of the slight misalignment of the census and the ASHE dates, they thought it was prudent to look at the adjacent years in ASHE, because there may be individuals in who just don't appear in ASHE 2011, either because they weren't in work on the 13th of April, or maybe they were in work, but their employer didn't respond to ASHE in that year. Those individuals might be in 2010 or 2012 ASHE. And so they've just broadened their view. So any unique individual who appears across those 3 years of ASHE is taken as the starting sample for the linking process, and ONS have sought to find those people in the 2011 census. I'll explain later that this 2011 census data, once it's been linked to ASHE, you can effectively link it to any year of the ASHE data set. So you could link it to 2017 ASHE ultimately, and I'll explain how that works a little bit later. But for the linkage process, they focused on individuals appearing in ASHE 2010, 11, or 12. Okay, so the linkage process went forward in 2 phases. So the first phase of the linkage process generated a set of linked outcomes which appeared in drop 1 of the dataset. So there's some people on the call who've already used that drop 1 dataset. What ONS did to generate the links in the drop 1 dataset, that was released in the autumn, was they did a deterministic match on 46 combinations of the name, gender, date of birth, and home postcode. So they take those fields in ASHE, they look at the combination of name, gender, date of birth, postcode. They try and find the same combination in the 2011 census records. Now, one nice outcome might be that you get an exact match on the full name, on the gender, on the date of birth, and the postcode. You can find somebody in ASHE and someone in the census who have exactly the same information on those complete 4 fields. That doesn't always happen, so that's why ONS have used 46 combinations. One combination is complete information across all of those 4 fields. Another combination might be a little bit more relaxed. So maybe we're looking for a match on name, date of birth, and postcode only. Maybe we're not looking for the full name, but we're only looking for the surname. Maybe we're not looking for the literal spelling of the name, but something that sounds like the spelling. So my surname is Forth, but maybe they would look for records which in the census maybe have the surname Ford, because that sounds similar. So they do these sort of various combinations to see if they can find either full matches on these four fields or partial matches. And the nature of the match is all recorded in the data set. So you know which of the 46 versions of this matching protocol has generated the linked outcome. If they don't get a match on those 46 deterministic matching combinations, then they do something a bit more probabilistic. Okay, so allowing more for typos or maybe transposition of words, of numbers and letters in the postcode. And then what you get as a result of those two different linkage processes is you get some correct links. So if you look right in the center of the diagram here, what we've got here is dataset 1. Let's assume that's ASHE. Dataset 2 is the census. Any records that appear in the intersection of the diagram are records that are common to both data sets. Now, hopefully you would want to try and find links for all of these, the orange, the purple, and the green red. But what probably happens is you only find some of the correct links. So those are the ones in the red circle. The orange and the purple are cases where you've got the same person in both data sets and you manage to link their records. There may then be people who appear in both data sets, but you don't manage to link them. You miss the link. So that's signified by the green and the red crosses here. They are the same person, but we haven't recognized that those records should be linked, maybe because there are typos in some of the entries on the linkage fields. The other scenario is that you link records that shouldn't have been linked. So those are the blue crosses at the top, where you've got two people who are essentially different people, but they look as though they're the same person. Yeah, maybe we haven't got enough complete information and we link their records accidentally. So you get various different outcomes from this linkage process, which you need to interrogate. So I just want to share a little bit about how ONS have been checking the validity of the linkages made in that process that I just described. What they do is they first, if we go back to this various steps of the linkage process, I said there were 46 combinations that they used in the deterministic matching process. They give all of those 46 combinations a different score, essentially based on the completeness of the match fields. So if two records were linked, having, exactly the same name information, exactly the same gender, exactly the same date of birth, exactly the same postcode, they would get a score of 1 because all of the key fields match exactly across the two data sets. But maybe if we couldn't find a link that way, but we managed to find a link maybe only to the surname and then the gender, the date of birth, and the postcode, that linkage would get a slightly lower score. Okay, so you have each linked record that comes out of this process is scored on, if you like, on the likely accuracy of the link. And then what ONS do is they do a load of manual checking. Okay, so they take samples of records with different match scores. So if you look at this graph here, the ones over on the left with a match score of 1, they are records that have matched perfectly on all of those 4 complete fields. Records over on the right here with a match score of 0.66, they might be records where maybe we've only matched on the surname and the postcode, or maybe the gender hasn't matched, but the other fields have matched, and so on. And so what ONS are doing through the manual checking process is they're looking at samples of records with different scores to see how many of those records actually look like true matches when you visually inspect the records and the data. So they do that for these different samples. And what you can see on this chart is the green bars are the percentage of records within that particular sample where a manual checker has said, yes, that looks like a true match. Okay. And then the yellow ones are where the manual checkers have said, I'm not sure that's a true match. I can't really tell. And then the red bars are the cases where the manual checker has looked at the linked record and said, no, that does not look like a match in practice. So those would be potentially incorrect links. Now, a link has been made by the algorithm. When you look at the records, they don't look like the same people. And what you'll see in this graph is as you move from right to left, the proportion of green in each sample goes up, and there's a jump around this match score of 0.82. And so once you get to a match score of 0.82, then the share of records in that particular group is invariably looks like true links, okay, from the manual inspection. So ONS eventually used this 0.82 score as a cutoff, because any record that has a deterministic linkage with a match score of 0.82, 90% of those records in the visual inspection turned out to look like true matches. And if you take all of the true matches in this visual inspection sample, so all of the green, then 82% of them have a match score above 0.82. Okay, so what ONS ended up doing is they say any of those deterministic linkage combinations that have a match score of 0.82 or above, we're going to put them in the released data set. So drop one of the data set contains links for any records with a match score equal to or above 0.82. That match score is on the data set. So if you want to explore the sensitivity of different analyses to including or excluding people with, say, a match score below 0.9, you can do that. Okay, so that's the linkage outcomes from drop one are then the following. 62% of all of the job records, sorry, my slides are going a bit haywire there. Let's start again. 62% of all of the job records from people resident in England and Wales in ASHE 2011 were linked to Census 2011 in this phase one linkage process that I've just described. And those records were released in the drop one data set. And I'll go on to talk about drop two in just a moment. Okay, so you've got a linkage rate of 62%. That equates to around about 100,000 records in ASHE 2011. And here's the distribution of the match scores. Around 80% of those 100,000 linked records had a match score of 1. In other words, they matched across ASHE and Census on all four of those complete linking fields: name, date of birth, gender, and home postcode. So those are the data that have been available since the autumn, and that some of you have been working with. Around 100,000 records for ASHE 2011 linked to the census. I said there were two phases of the linkage process, so now let me explain what ONS have been doing since the autumn and what has led to drop two. One of the reasons why this linkage rate here of 62% was not higher, one reason why it wasn't higher is that quite a lot of the records in ASHE don't actually have their name recorded. So ONS only have the date of birth, the gender, and the home postcode. Now, if you've only got that information going into your deterministic match process and you haven't got the name, it's quite hard to determine whether two records that you link are identical. So yeah, that's one of the big reasons why that linkage rate wasn't higher. And ONS wanted to try and find ways to improve this linkage rate by being able to link records where they didn't have access to the name. And that was a key part of the phase two. So what they were doing in phase two was taking those records that didn't get matched in phase one, so the 38%, if you like, and many of those, as I say, didn't have a name record in the admin data for ASHE. And what they did, ONS, was they brought in additional information then that are present on ASHE and Census. So specifically the workplace location, the occupation, or the industry. And so they were now looking for deterministic matches on the combination of gender, date of birth, home postcode, workplace location, and one or other of occupation or industry. And so they've, through that process, managed to link a whole bunch of more records, and those additional match records are the ones that are now being added to the data set in drop 1. What happens as a result of that is that the linkage rate increases from 62% to 74% in ASHE 2011. So now almost 3/4 of the ASHE 2011 records have census data attached to them because of this additional phase of the linkage process. Okay, now you can identify on the data set the records that have been matched through this additional phase of matching. So if you don't think that if you think these may be less reliable, you can remove them from your analyses if you want. But of course, if you're happy to use these matched cases, you have a much larger sample to work with. So the drop 2 of the data set, which is in the process of being released now, includes the outcomes from both phase 1 and phase 2. So you're not going to have to add any data together. Once you get access to the drop 2 data set, it will look very much like the drop 1 data set. It will just have more cases that are linked to the census. Okay, so just to be clear on the numbers of observations that you've now got available, in ASHE 2011, I'm focusing on ASHE 2011, that's where the linkage rate is highest. In total in ASHE 2011, there are 183,000 jobs, okay? And 121,000 of those have been linked to the census. But remember that I said that you're very unlikely to get linked to the census for England and Wales if you weren't actually resident in England and Wales in 2011. So there are a whole bunch of people in ASHE 2011 who are living in Scotland. Now, the odd 1 or 2 of those get linked to the census, but most of them don't. So a better base for working out the linkage rate is to focus initially on all those people in ASHE who were resident in England or Wales in ASHE. Yeah, so they're recorded in ASHE as being resident in England or Wales, and that's 163,185. And of those 163,000, 120,000 get linked to the census as a result of the 2 phases of linkage. So that gives us a linkage rate effectively of 74% of eligible records. Okay, so 120,000 people. Of course, we've got 43,000 people there who look to be eligible for being linked to the census, but who haven't been. The linkage rate, 74%. So there is some potential for some bias in the linkage here. What we find is that the people who do get linked to the census across these 2 phases of linking are more likely to be in higher paid jobs. They're more likely to have standard hours. They're more likely to be middle-aged employees, and they're more likely to be working outside of London. And if you look at those characteristics, those are the kind of characteristics that go with stable employment or stable residence. In any linkage process, once you've got people moving around between residences or between jobs, that's always going to make linkage harder because the 2 bits of information in the 2 data sets might not quite be collected at the same time. Any linkage process tends to have more difficulty linking people within London because there's so much more mobility of residents as well as job mobility. So you get slightly higher linkage rates for these types of people. What that means is that the linked ASHE Census data set has a slightly higher proportion of these types of jobs than the full ASHE data set. And so we've been trying to address that issue with some weights. So I won't go into a lot of detail, but we have some slight linkage bias here. And we go through a standard weighting procedure, running a probit model to find the probability of being linked, then creating an adjusted ASHE weight, which accounts for that probability, and then doing some usual trimming and so on. And so let me just show you what that does to the data set. In column 1 here, we have the full ASHE sample. So let's say for people in England and Wales, it's the 163,000 records. And here you can see their profile by age. So for example, we have 13.25% age 45 to 49. So if you look at the 45 to 49 age group, 13.25% of employees in the full ASHE sample for England and Wales, once we use the standard ASHE weight, are aged 45 to 49. If we go to the ASHE-Census sample, so that sample of 123,000 records, it's 14.7%. So people aged 45 to 49 are slightly overrepresented in the linked sample of 123,000 records, and that's what's shown by the mean squared error here. And then in column 4, you'll see what happens when we apply our adjusted ASHE-Census weight. So this weight is supposed to remove the linkage bias, and you can see on the 45 to 49 row, it does that very well. It returns the share of people aged 45 to 49 back to 13.26. Okay, so the bias by age is removed by our ASHE weight, our ASHE-Census weight. Here's the bias by pay decile. If you look at column 3, the squared error, you'll see the bias is in the low paid section. We've got too few people on low pay in the ASHE-Census sample, and our ASHE weight resolves that because you can see the bias disappears in column 5. If we go on to hours, you'll see there's a small bias towards people working 30 to 47 hours a week. So 68% in the ASHE sample, 70% in the linked ASHE-Census sample. Again, our weights resolve that problem. And here's the distribution by region. So as I said, slight underrepresentation of London. 16% of jobs in the full ASHE sample are located in London. In the ASHE-Census linked sample, it's only 14.6, and the weights get rid of most of that bias. Okay, so you have weights on the microdata that will restore the profile of the ASHE-Census linked sample so that it looks very much like the full ASHE sample, removing the linkage bias. ONS have linked as I said, the ASHE 2010, 11 and 12 to the census. So those are the ASHE years they've used in order to establish links to the census. But because ASHE is a panel and you can follow people over time with a unique reference number, you can spread this census data out across the whole of the available data set. So you can take the census data that's been linked on in ASHE 2011-12, and as long as the person who was linked at that point is also in the data set in 2001, then you have the census data available to use in 2001 as well. Of course, what you have to bear in mind there is that some personal characteristics stay fixed over time. Your country of birth doesn't change. So if you had used census country of birth on ASHE 2018, that would be a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Other personal characteristics do change over time. So you might change your religion, for example. Your health status may change. So obviously, once you get further away from the census date of 2011, the reliability of those kind of data items is inevitably going to degrade. But just to give you a bit more of an insight into what you got in ASHE 2011, we've, as I said, around 120,000 linked records. You've got 44,000 degree holders. You've got 14,000 people born outside the UK. You've got about 12,000 people who are members of non-white ethnic groups. And you've got around 7,000 people with a long-term health problem or disability. So you've got reasonable numbers here to work at, particularly if you're looking at subgroups. There is a question which often arises, well, okay, you've got these common fields in the two data set, but how well do they line up? Well, in the ASHE linked sample, we measure gender in ASHE and the census, and you can see the consistency is very high. Similarly for age, similarly for region. You would expect that because these are variables that have been used in the linkage process. Occupation and industry are less consistent across the two data sets. Now, some of that might be because we've linked the wrong person, but you can also see how an individual employee reporting their occupation may describe it slightly differently to their employer, and that might lead to a different categorization in either of those data sets. So it doesn't necessarily mean the linkage is wrong, but just to show you the consistency across the data set. So very briefly, just for a couple of minutes, just to show you some of what you can do with this data set. I'm focusing on ethnicity. We've written a research paper where we're trying to understand the ethnic wage gap, and for the first time trying to understand how important is it where you work. So we know there are big ethnic wage gaps in the labour market. Certain people of certain ethnicities tend to earn a lot less than white employees, others earn more. But how important is where you work in explaining those wage gaps? Well, what we start with is comparing ethnic wage differentials in ASHE-Census with ethnic wage differentials that you see in the annual population survey, which other than ASHE is probably the best data set for looking at ethnic wage gaps. The first thing to notice is you've got bigger samples in ASHE-Census. So if you look at the column headed N, you'll see the sample sizes are almost twice as big as you would get from the annual population survey. But if you look at the ethnic wage differentials, we've got mean pay rates here, hourly pay, and then we've got premiums or penalties. You'll see that the rank order of the premiums or penalties is very similar. So Chinese and Indian employees tend to earn more than whites. Black Caribbeans, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, African, and Black African, and Bangladeshi earn considerably less. So when you're using a data set like APS, you've really only got personal and household characteristics to use to explain these ethnic wage differentials. But obviously with ASHE-Census, we can start to bring in employer characteristics. I'm not going to go into the details of how we do it, but what I'm just going to show you this chart. And the first thing to focus on is the black line. So here we're looking at quantiles of the wage distribution. So down at the bottom end of the wage distribution on the left, there's very little wage gap between white employees and Indian employees. I'm focusing on Indian here. As you go up through the wage distribution, that wage gap gets bigger. So at the top of the white wage distribution, white employees are earning considerably less than those people at the top of the Indian wage distribution. That's shown by the rising black line. If you focus then on the dashed red line, that shows you the importance of differences in personal characteristics like education or age or where you live. And that's what you get from a standard wage regression on the annual population survey, showing that a lot of this wage premium for high earning Indians over white workers is due to their personal characteristics. What we do in our paper is we add in then firm fixed effects. So we're trying to identify the role of the firm in that wage differential. We then get the solid red line and the blue line. And what the blue line is showing you is that a good part of the wage premium earned by high earning Indian employees is due to where they work. So there's a lot of sorting going out in the labour market by ethnicity. One of the reasons why Indians have a wage premium over white employees in the British economy is that Indians tend to work in high wage firms, more so than white employees. And we can show that for the first time from this data set. So briefly, as we finish, how would you access the data set? Well, drop 1 was available in September 2022. The drop 2 is now with ONS and it's about to drop in the Secure Research Service. So just with them, final processing awaiting release. You would access that data set via the ONS Secure Research Service. So I've got a link in the slides here, which will circulate, and that link will take you to the Secure Research Service metadata catalog and show you the entry for ASHE-Census, and you'd use that to apply for access to the data set. You'd make a normal project application, as you would normally do for the SRS, and then you would cite ASHE-Census as the data set that you want to use. And that we have written a user guide which explains all of what I've described in this webinar today, and that user guide is available on our website at wagedynamics.com. And again, the link here is in the slide. So you'll have, I think it's about 35-page method document which will explain all the variables on the data set, the linkage rates, and so on, and explain the weights and so on and so forth. So that should enable you to get started quickly. And if you haven't used ASHE before, you can use the quick start guide, which is elsewhere on our website, to get you up to speed on that. So that's what I wanted to say. I'm going to stop now and invite any questions. If you did want to get in touch after the webinar, you can use my email here, or do sign up to our mailing list on the web project website, wagedynamics.com. Thank you very much. So let me disable